Buju, Wago Shindagu, Migizi and Dodame, Minawa, Gazagasquaji Mekog, and Dunjaba. I'm really excited that you all came out tonight. I wanted to give you a brief introduction in Ojibwe because I always rely upon people smarter, older, wiser than me who say when you meet new people, make sure you share your native name, your clan, where you're from. I was sharing my native name is Wagush, which means fox. I'm from the Eagle clan, come from Leech Lake. Most of my family is really from Bena. It's not terribly far from here. And I'm just excited to have a conversation with you all tonight. This is an interesting time in the history of humans and our country, and it's a testy time as well. And so I've been giving a lot of thought, over the past few years and in recent months about where are we going, what really matters, how can we figure out how to get along. Humans can be so hard on each other. And I was asked to share a little bit tonight about Indigenous perspectives about this challenging time. And what I'll do is I'll spend a couple of minutes just giving you a little bit of background information on me, not because that's the most important thing to know, but simply because nobody sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we're all a little different. And once I've done that, then I will share a few things to kind of frame a conversation, and I'm going to hold a fair amount of space just to field your questions, so you can think about what those are, and when we get there, you can take me in whatever direction is of interest to you. There's so much going on, so much to talk about. There's no way to exhaust a conversation, no matter how much time we spend together tonight. So I also wanted to say that I'm happy to do so, to stay in touch with you. I've got cards on the table over there. I've got lots of free information on the website, lists of books, got a YouTube channel with more. If you're interested in me being a talking head, I've got lots of interest in working with y'all. All right, now I'm going to turn this on and we'll get going. I've got a little bit in the PowerPoint here. That's the late, great Tom Stillday, one of my mentors. I fondly remember bringing him to our university to give a speech. He had been the first person who was named chaplain for the state senate here in Minnesota who was not from a religious tradition that came from across the ocean, which says something. Our systems are pretty colonial, which is taking one language, one culture, one religion, using it to supplant the others. It's about erasure, which is why a lot of Americans, because we're all steeped in the colonial culture, are so worried about who's trying to erase me now. From all groups. And it makes it difficult just to get things done productively in mixed company. But Tom was fun. He'd say, I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it. And that was even before the stuff we've seen in more recent years. When he came to our university, I worked at Bemidji State to give his graduation banquet speech. I'd been priming him because he was so notoriously long-winded. I said, you got like 15 minutes. You got to keep this short, throw in a joke or two, focus on the students. Okay, got it. He got up there, he spoke for about an hour and a half. Wrecked the agenda. He was all in Ojibwe. We're in mixed company and watching the president and deans are glazing over. He only said one thing in English. He said, all you people who study Indians, study that. And he went and sat down. So I thought he was hilarious. But he had good points. Like most of the books written about us are written by people who've never talked to us. Right? What they call native history is usually like somebody looking in the archives for what the white army officer wrote in his journal when he met the natives. Well, that's not a history of natives. That's a history of white folks when they met natives, which is important history, but it's not native history, right? And it's not only that, it's like the school's turnaround plan, it's the substance abuse intervention plan, the economic development plan, it's all of the plans. We're missing from so many data sets. And then we're so prevalent in some of the other ones. So I thought he had a pretty interesting and disarming way of sharing about that. All right. Oh, I see what happened there. So there's home. You know. And my family, my mom's family were, well, her mom was a Matthews, and the Matthews-Bena family actually came from the Grand Rapids area. So after the 1855 treaty, they had actually established a dozen Ojibwe reservations across Minnesota, and one was at Pokegama. So prior to the construction of the dam, they actually call Ga-Bakegamog. It's where the water goes off to the side or in different directions because the water kind of fans out in that area. And they tried to relocate all of the Ojibwe people many times. So they tried to concentrate everybody at Leech Lake. So in 1864, all of the town of Bemidji was part of the Leech Lake Reservation. It was much larger than it is now. And then later in 1867, they created the White Earth Reservation and trimmed the Leech Lake down. And so the Matthews family, would be my great-great-grandfather, was Nokase. He was a village chief at Pokegama. And then his daughter, Annie Noke, from the name Nokase. And then Isabel, she actually had the last name Brown, married a Matthews. They moved from to Bena. And then she married a Bena boy. The Seeley family was all longtime residents of Bena. So that's where a lot of my mom's family comes from. You know, half the town are my cousins. That's not even an exaggeration. Yeah, watch out if you go through there, by the way. Couple folks in the family tree with that super ancient face. John Smith, he was famously photographed too, but he was born in the late 1700s and he died in 1922. He wasn't even the record holder for human longevity. Also quite amazing. Yeah, and I always thought, you know, when I was going to school, why he? You know, he was in Minnesota when all of the land, like all the green squares and the orange squares, was all native land. He was there when natives owned 4% of their own res. Yeah, so there are a lot of stories to take. And when we get to the questions, feel free to ask, like, how did that 4% thing happen? I'm happy to share more about that. And what are we trying to do about it now? You may have seen there was a land back parcel repatriation from the Chippewa National Forest to Leech Lake, and there are other proposals in other places. So if you want to talk about what some of that is and what it could look like and what's being proposed and things like that, I'm happy to share more. And then Wabujig, a famous warrior in the Ojibwe world. When I was a kid going to school, I didn't have a way to really speak to this, but as I got older, it started to bother me that I could go to school for 13 years in a row. You know, kindergarten through 12th grade, learn everything I needed to be successful in the world, and none of it had anything to do with me. So it's kind of like the message being delivered by the system was screaming at me through absent narratives. And the absent narratives were saying, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. So I'd get a chip on my shoulder. Felt like an assault on my age-old way of being. What happens when people feel assaulted and you get, you know, our instinctive caveman responses, fight, flight, freeze, that kind of stuff. Professionals are scratching their heads. How come we have truancy problems with these students? I'm like, flight. How come we have discipline problems with these students? I'm like, fight. How come these ones are spaced out, zoned out, and hanging out at the Indian Ed office all the time? I'm like, freeze. And of course, we're humans and we're complex and it's not quite that simple. But those are things that are going on for a lot of our kids. There's a real effort to change this. And it's actually starting to have some wins too. We have a big overhaul of the educational standards in the state of Minnesota that has a lot more content on Native people and expectations that we learn about Natives as Native nations, not just another racial or ethnic group, and speak to Indigenous ways of knowing in science. And I was actually working with the teaching team here a little bit today, talking about just some more practical things about how to address some of that. These are some pictures of my father through different chapters of his life. Some people here knew my dad. He was actually not Native at all, so I show up kind of brown, and I got some beads and braids, or man bun today, but so sometimes it surprises people to know my dad wasn't Native at all. He was born in Vienna, Austria. and spoke wonderful German throughout his life, but he was an Austrian Jewish Holocaust survivor and had to run for it at age 13. Got out of there at age 13, made it to America at age 14. By age 17, he lied about his age, signed up for the U.S. Army. World War II was still going. I think he wanted to go kill Nazis or something. And they sent him to the Pacific Theater, so he was stationed in the Philippines. But eventually, he made his way to northern Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. That's the short version. By the way, sometimes the question comes up, like, because I speak a lot to Native things, what about your dad? It's like, well, my dad had a long life. Loved him dearly. We were very close. That's an important part of me. You know, I showed up a little brown when I came out of the womb. I can't do much about that. I was raised in a Native space that has some impact, but I honor my dad and everything he did and everything he stood for and came from. Ich verstehe ein bisschen Deutsch und ich bin Österreicher. Yeah, I'm an Austrian citizen, as well as a U.S. citizen. And I'm working on the German. My mom grew up in Bena. She was actually born in the Cass Lake Indian Hospital, Cass Lake. Born and raised on the res. And actually one of her friends who she went to school with afterwards is in the audience here tonight, Nancy, so thanks for joining us. And when my mom was a kid, you know, I was just over there today. The remains of the little house that she grew up in is still there. And it's kind of unbelievable. All that's left really is like the foundation and some wood around that. But they couldn't fit everybody in the house. So every night they'd have to throw all the chairs out and the kids would have to sleep in a row on the floor. They'd pull the kids from school because they all had to help with food production. So wild rice season, everybody's out for 2 weeks. You know, maple season, everyone's out again, and things like that, hunting season. And it was pretty amazing, but during her childhood, she went to school all of her K-12 years on the res. And Leech Lake is a pretty big res, not just geographically, but maybe 9,000 tribal members or something like that. And she only met one professional Native person her entire childhood. So out of 9,000 tribal members, they couldn't find one to be a teacher, a social worker, a police officer, a banker, or whatever. More evidence of the colonial nature of our systems. By the way, the one professional Native person she met was a school nurse. And she thought, maybe I could do that. So she finished high school, went off to nursing school, met Nancy here. And one of her first jobs after nursing school, she came back home and took a job working for our tribe's health program. And she thought, even here, Native people are getting pushed around. Enough of that. And she went back to school and she got a law degree. And she actually became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. So when I was a kid, she'd bring me with her to court. And she'd say, you just sit there and don't say a word. So, you know, I'd sit there and not say a word. My mom was small, but she could be feisty, you know. And I can't really remember her court cases, but I do remember things. I remember that she was the only woman in court. I remember that she and her law partner, Paul Day, were the only natives in court. And I came walking out of there thinking, you know what? We can do stuff. We just had the retirement celebration for Paul Day. He was chief judge at Leech Lake at the time. And I had to tell him, you were the first Native man I ever saw doing something professional. And we were in a room full of Native lawyers, judges, social workers, and educators. I said, look how far we've come. Look how far we've come. It's amazing. And what a couple of trailblazers could do to help make that possible. Not that everyone else didn't also do their parts of the lift. But I always found that to be quite inspiring. Sometimes we just hesitate to even share economic data on the ancestral village of Bena because it can do something, which is to reinforce one of the stereotypes about natives, which says we're all living in squalor on a reservation. And both of those statements are factually incorrect. About 50% of the enrolled tribal citizenry lives off reservation. About 70% of the self-identified native population lives off reservation. And our economic landscape is really pretty complex. I could recommend, if anyone wants like follow-up homework or something, you could check out the TED Talk by this Nigerian literary figure. Her name's Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If you can't remember that name, don't worry. The title is very easy. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. And in The Danger of a Single Story, it's got millions of views on YouTube, easy to find. Among the great things she shares is that the problem with stereotypes is not so much that they're incorrect, as much as they are incomplete. And they leave you with one little narrow story to understand a whole group of people. And if you get a narrow single story about anybody, you're going to get it wrong. If you look at a human being and you only judge what you see during one encounter or one day, that's not going to tell you the totality of who they are, right? So, like, for example, if you wanted to do something like study white folk in America, by the way, a lot of people do, and you only looked at like poverty in rural white Appalachia and thought, oh, those poor people. What happened to the white family? Oh, the meth. That would not give you an accurate picture of what it means to be white in America. It wouldn't even give you an accurate picture of what it means to be white in Appalachia. Same thing if you only looked at, the wealth on New York's Upper East Side and thought, talk about everything handed on a silver platter. Wow. That's also not the whole story. But if you were to study white folk in America, you wouldn't get a single story. You get many stories. Even the movies, right? There's like white guys who are good guys. There's white guys who are bad guys. There are white guys who are good guys, Breaking Bad. There's a whole series about that. There are white guys who are like bad guys turning good. Check out Jaime Lannister in Game of Thrones. And as a result, you can even watch a movie like Psycho and you're not like, white people, run. If you are to study natives in America, you will see more movies about aliens than Native Americans. Most of the movies are reinforcing tropes about poverty, substance abuse, violence, and stuff like that. It is evolving, just not thoroughly evolved. We got more native authored content. That's from books to movies to reservation dogs to whatever. It's growing. It's getting better, but it's like steps on a journey rather than the end of the journey. And so most Americans just don't get a lot to disrupt the single story narrative. Even like the educational standards that do have to do with native stuff, for the most part, it's things from before 1900, which can just reinforce the idea that we are something that happened in the past. And it's a little different maybe here, but traveling, I've been to all 50 states, traveling in the American South or in the East Coast, I've had people say, oh, it's just such a shame they killed all the Indians. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm feeling pretty good today. And they're like, oh, that's a good point. It's like, it's not a point, But some people really don't see that. All right. Also, the economics are quite interesting. I won't trouble you with a lot of data sets tonight, but this one's kind of cool. So if you look back in 1969, 57% of the native population was below the poverty line. 57%. Like, we had a Great Depression in America when the unemployment rate reached 15%. So for natives, the Great Depression started in the middle of the 1800s with the establishment of reservations, and it has never ended. And when you skip forward and look up here like 2020, 23% of the native population was below the poverty line. And it tells you two things. One is, well, if 23% of a population is below the poverty line, that's gross, that's unacceptable, that's an indictment on America, not its native population. But the other thing it says is we just shaved well over 30 percentage points off of Indigenous poverty. Not because of a government handout or intervention or anything like that. That's something Native people engineered for themselves. So if you want to know something about how to disrupt systemic intergenerational poverty, ask Indigenous people. They have the best track record in the United States of America for doing exactly that. And when we can look at it that way, then instead of like, oh, those poor people, it's more like, how did they do that? What do I need to know? I might have things I can share, but I certainly have a lot to learn too. Can we scale that up in other places? How? Right? And it changes our disposition from like Jesus complex to brothers and sisters, which is a better place to be. Natives employ 1.1 million people in the United States, pay out $49.5 billion in employee compensation, $127 billion that should be net economic output. Even the Cherokee Nation budget alone was $3.8 billion with a B dollars. In 16 counties in Minnesota, tribes aren't big employers, they're the biggest employers of all. Be nice to natives, you'd probably end up working for one someday. I like this quote that was shared by Abigail Echohawk, and she said, "We are not a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors who survived so I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I am colonially underserved. I am institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient." Much more accurate. When I was a tyke, oh man, I had some good perspective builders. Even when my mom went to law school, by the way, she did that in Washington, D.C. And so we had a house up here in the Northland. We were at Ball Club Powwow every summer, even in her law school years. But I'd go back and forth between, the resi house and a big city, being a native, being the native, and it was a perspective builder. Sometimes it was funny, like my first sleepover at a friend's house in DC when I woke up, kicked open the front door, went outside, peed all over the rose bushes, and friend's mom's like, "Wait, no, stop, don't, we have an indoor bathroom." I was like, "Oh, you have indoor bathrooms, I didn't know," and didn't think much of it. And sometimes there were things that were painful or awkward or whatnot. I never experienced what my mom experienced in terms of having to be someone producing food for the family or, the kinds of poverty that she really experienced. But thinking about that little house, our summer house, it didn't have electricity or running water. We'd buy a gallon of milk, tie a string on it, sink it in the creek in front of the house, which was spring-fed and kept it cool, and, wash up in the creek in the summer and enamel wash basins in the winter. But by the time I hit about middle school, my mom had her law degree, she built a nice house, and the economic profile for our family changed. To me, it revealed what we talk about with regard to the American dream, like it's half true. The true part's what I saw my dad do, what I saw my mom do, but only half. Kind of with George Carlin, you remember the old comedian, when he said, we call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. And by that, I think he simply meant that there are barriers out there and they are not equitably distributed. So it was certainly a perspective builder as I was growing up. There's my crew, by the way. This picture is a little bit old, so we have 9 children. I got 6 out the door. I got 3 to go, and we're starting in the grandbaby business. There are 4 of them, and it is lots and lots of fun. I could share kid antics and grandkid antic stories for our entire time together. Feel free to ask. And so a picture of the family property. Among the things that had happened when my dad kind of landed in Minnesota, and he was, kind of restarting his life. He kind of did that a few times. And my mom was trying to kind of find her pathway out of poverty and so forth. They acquired this piece of property. And if you look up the hill from here, it didn't look like this at all. It actually was kind of wide open farm fields and stuff like that. And that's my dad on the tractor with my brother. What they did is they started planting trees, and they planted all of the trees in this picture right here. Wow. Completely transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. I go out there and walk around under these trees, and I'm still in awe. It was just a couple of people. Of course, they did have a child labor force. But it was millions of trees. And I think a lot of us look around at the climate change, the politics, the race relations, and the stuff, and think, man, there's not a lot I can do. Try to be decent human. I'll tell my kids to be decent humans. I hope it's enough, and it never feels like it's quite enough, because all that's necessary for evil to triumph is good people to do nothing or too little. But it's not like we got to take this mountain of problems humans have been making for thousands of years and move that whole mountain right now. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it really can change everything. That's the work. If I hold up my finger and say, what is this? I might start a fight, unless if I clarify in what language, like in the language of body parts. Indeed, it's a finger. But in the language of numbers, well, that's a 1. And in the language of space, that's up. So, who's right? And of course, they're all right. It's a matter of language, perspective, and context, right? But all too often, when we have tough topics like coronavirus, race relations, culture wars, whatever, somebody's up there saying this here is a finger, it's not an elbow, it's not a toe, everybody else, shh. And somebody's listening going, what? That's a 1, not a 2. See? They just don't understand. Totally miss each other. But when we can see that as a finger and 1 and up and all the other many things that it is, multiple perspectives, then you can get stuff done. By the way, great advice to have multiple perspectives if you ever want to have a friend, or be in a marriage, or work in a workplace with more than 2 people. You are not always going to see everything the same way. You could be married to somebody for 50 years in a row, and they will still take you by surprise and give you something to argue about. So instead of, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about, I'm sorry, I didn't know that could be upsetting. Could you help me understand? Totally different response. And I do think the shut up culture is causing harm and making it hard to do things together. I like this Cornel West quote. He said, we are not a nation of immigrants. We are a nation with immigrants, with indigenous people, and with enslaved Africans in its origin. What a difference one little word makes. I'm sure the intent when people say things like, we are a nation of immigrants, is to say, hey, we're all in this together, but not realizing it could be very off-putting to indigenous people, or for many Black Americans whose ancestors didn't voluntarily choose to come. One little word change. And by the way, you could put that word change in any of the fault lines in our society. America is not a Christian nation. It is a nation with Christians. Also with Jews, with Muslims, with Sufis, with traditional Native Americans, with atheists, with agnostics, all of whom are just as American as anybody else. It is the effort to say that America is a blank and fill in the blank with any subset of us that will be inherently marginalizing and divisive, as well as factually incorrect. So I got to talk about everything you wanted to know about Indians, but were afraid to ask. I stumbled onto this very much by accident. I think I finished high school with a plan that a lot of high schoolers have, which is I'm going to get out of town and never come back. I thought very naively, and I have to laugh at myself, I thought that there was a way to escape from the brambled racial borderland of my youth and I got into Princeton University. I thought, hooray, these people will be better educated, the ignorance will be behind me, this is going to be so much better. I got there, first person I met was like, dude, are you native? Where's your tomahawk? And I remember thinking, oh no, these are the dumbest smart people I've ever met, and the ignorance will follow me everywhere. The brambled racial borderland will follow me everywhere. Then I just wanted to come home and never leave. And I guess in the long run, that is kind of what I did. But I did have a great experience at Princeton, I truly did. My freshman year assigned roommate was a citizen of Sri Lanka, and we became besties and roomed together 4 years in a row, and best man at one another's weddings and all of that. And I collected friends throughout my life, lots of weird, strange, interesting people, and we still seek each other out. And I think it has helped reinforce in me, and build in me the musculature for just loving humans and trying to look at things from different perspectives. One was escaped from war-torn Vietnam, for whom Ronald Reagan's shining city on a hill speech and republicanism was the best thing in America. I have another one who is a communist. You should hear him argue. But they drive across the country to watch one another's kids. And it was a reminder that we'd probably all benefit from taking all of the people that we want to give a good talking to and give them a good listening to. It makes a big difference. Well, while at Princeton, I got super homesick. And I heard at one point that there was this Comanche spiritual leader coming out there to run sweat lodge ceremonies. Now, the Comanche come from Oklahoma and Texas. And part of me is thinking, like, why are they out here in New Jersey doing ceremonies? Is this like have pipe well travel, culture for sale, something like that. So I was a little skeptical. Went out there, it was about 4 p.m, beautiful sunshiny day, and there were some surprises in store for me. So surprise number one, there were like 20 people waiting for a sweat lodge ceremony. You know what a sweat lodge ceremony is, right? Like they heat rocks on a fire, bring them inside of this domed lodge, pour some water on there, make steam. So it's kind of like a sauna, but people are praying and singing, and it's kind of like going into the womb of Mother Earth, being reborn, healthy, and so forth. Anyways, surprise number one, 20 people waiting around for the sweat lodge ceremony. They were all white. Surprise number two, they were all naked. And as I drove up, I had mixed feelings. Like, part of me did want to laugh, because, it's 20 naked people standing around in the woods. Like, what else can you do, right? Like, come on. Part of me wanted to run, because, dang, that's 20 naked people standing around in the woods. Like, I'm out. Part of me was also getting mad. Like, are you serious? Get naked, dance around a fire? Is that what you think we're all about? So, being naive, I parked the car, shut it off, get out. I'm immediately folded into a tight embrace by one of these naked strangers who's now hugging me hard and saying, I'm so sorry what my people did to your people. So awkward. Now the desire to laugh, run, get mad is just growing. And I looked at her face. She was an elder. There were tears in her eyes. And it occurred to me, this thing that happens to people from a minoritized group that doesn't happen to everyone else quite as often happens, where you get asked to be spokesperson for a whole group of people. And I'm usually thinking, I got a house full of natives, I don't even know what they're thinking most of the time. I can only represent me. But it occurred to me that if I just left, she'd just keep thinking what she's thinking. If I got mad and told her off, the only native she meets is an angry one. And so I had to think fast. So I said, ma'am, could you put some clothes on? Because I'd love to talk to you about all of this. And she did. And we had a good talk. And I do think she learned a few things, but in a weird way, I did too. One of the things I learned is that it is so helpful to just make some safe space, to do your best to give a meaningful answer, not just an angry rebuke. And I started to save the questions. Is it Indian American Indian, Indigenous, Native, Native American, Aboriginal, First Nation person, or what? And there's nothing like not knowing how to frame a question to really immobilize a conversation. They included, what is sovereignty? What's a native nation? What about those casinos? Is that good? Is that bad? What about per caps? Good? Bad? What about tribal enrollment? And then also, like, what's a naming ceremony? What's happening with Indigenous language revitalization? What about the Dakota Access Pipeline? What about the Line 3 replacement? What about Line 5 replacement? Did you see that movie, Bad River? You know, all kinds of different things. Also, what do you think about mascots for sports teams? And there's so many questions. And I came to realize that I knew what it was like living in this body, in this part of the world, you know, with my strange family, multiracial family. But my mom had a law degree. She actually became a tribal judge. I still would have been hard pressed to give you a decent explanation of tribal sovereignty by the time I finished high school. It was never taught in school. And so some things I just knew from experience, but other things I had to hunt for the answers. In many ways, I am still hunting for the answers. So I started trying to, you know, figure these things out so I could give better answers, so I could explore them, and I love to read and, you know, talk and travel and all these different things. And so then I started giving a couple talks, and then eventually it turned into a book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. And that first came out in like 2012. And then since then, so many other things happened. Just from 2012 to the present, that's like 12, 13 years, you know. We had so much happen. There was Dakota Access Pipeline. There have been, you know, that confrontation at the Lincoln Memorial. There have been Deb Haaland appointed to the cabinet. There have been all kinds of things, you know, good, bad, ugly, and everything in between. And so we did a version for young readers that came out. It's kind of geared for high school. That greatly expanded the number of questions and kind of retooled the format. And then just a few months ago, we came out with the expanded edition, you know, that covers just a lot more territory in the made for adults version. So we got 2 copies of the same book. And so I'll say that much to kind of get us framed. What I'll do now is I'm going to just throw it open to ask questions, and we will take as many as we can in the time that we have. And Miigwech for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer.